pleased that this can still go on and that everyone could make it, and that the LERA organizers could make it possible for all of this to happen. So let me quickly go over the rules which we've discussed. So each presenter is going to have 10 minutes. So please keep a timer open on your end, but I'll also facilitate on my end. So I'll hold up a 1 minute and a stop, please sign. So if you can also keep an eye on me, if not, I can come in too verbally. So after the 3 presentations, Sue Houseman will have a 12-minute discussion of the papers. Thank you, Sue. And then we can give the authors a chance to respond and open the floor up to general questions and discussions from everyone. So there's 2 ways that we can do the participation. And I think feel free to use both, and I'll try to keep track of both. So one, if you scroll up to the top of your screen, you'll see a participants button. And there you should be able to raise your hand. There should be, when you click participants, a hand raising feature. And alternatively, if you click the ellipsis that says more, there's a chat window. If everyone can find that, you can also put your questions in the chat, and we can keep track of questions there. So. Is everyone able to find those features? Okay, great. So Alejandro is still not here, right? Okay, so why don't I, then being the next in order, why don't I give my presentation? Never had it not connect to my iPad before. There we go. Everyone can see my screen? Okay. Okay, great. So I'll be presenting effects of mandated driver pay increases on the gig economy. And this is joint work with Michael Reich and James Parrott. So in February 2019, New York City became the first state to mandate a minimum pay structure for rideshare trips. So I'll go into the exact details of what this looked like in a few slides, but the intent was to increase the average wage after expenses to equal New York City's minimum wage of $15 per hour. So the actual increase in the hourly wage that this had is going to be an empirical question. So most people, you're aware that the prices in this industry are flexible, and so they're set on a minute-by-minute basis, reportedly to reflect supply and demand patterns. So economic theory tells us that increasing the wage is going to have 2 consequences, immediate consequences. First, there should be a labor supply response. And I forgot to hit record, which I was asked to do. Oh, I think we are recording. Okay. So there's this labor supply response, and more people want to work at higher wages. And this may have this countervailing effect to reduce surge and then lower wages. The second is a demand response. To the extent that wage increases are passed on in the form of higher prices, this is going to lower demand, and demand in this context is going to be trips per hour. So this question has been previously examined in a paper by Hall et al., which used Uber data and looked at increases in Uber's base fare. And what the authors found in that paper is that increasing Uber's base fare led to an immediate increase in the hourly wage, but this faded away after about 6 weeks as supply and demand patterns adjusted. So our paper is going to differ in 2 key respects. So the data we use are going to come from New York City's Taxi and Limousine Commission, which compiles data for the 4 main rideshare companies. And so we're going to be able to follow a driver across all 4 of these apps. And Lyft in particular has been growing in its market share over this period. And the second, and I think the most important difference, is that this increase in the pay mandate is going to apply to all of the rideshare companies. So unlike just an increase in Uber's base fare that was being studied before, the incentives in our setting are going to be different and should limit cross-platform substitution, although our data is going to allow us to pick it up even if there is any. So here is a cut of the data looking at average pay per trip and average fare per trip. Pay is in blue and fares are in red. And so February 2019, this is when the pay standard goes into effect. And you can see that average pay and fares appear to increase in the period afterwards. I want to note some other important dates. In this period here, this is when 2 of the major rideshare companies have their initial public offerings. And that potentially puts some downward pressure on fares in order to maintain ridership. And you'll also see that we have an unfortunate gap in our data here from the period from July 2018 to January 2019. And that gap there is because the TLC didn't mandate any reporting of pay, unfortunately, during this period. So here is the formula for the pay standard. And what it does is it consists of 4 multipliers: a multiplier on in-time miles, a multiplier on out-of-town miles, on in-town minutes, and out-of-town minutes. And so for the purposes of this paper, we're going to be taking these as exogenous. But Michael and James actually wrote the report behind these numbers, and you can see their report for the careful analysis of where these numbers came from. So this is just showing compliance with the policy, what share of the fares were below this pay standard. And so we can see what people were being paid before and calculate this counterfactual of what they would have been paid under the pay standard. And we see that prior to implementation, about 40 to 50% of rides were paid below what this minimum pay standard would dictate. And then we essentially have 100% compliance with the policy. Key to our empirical strategy in the paper is going to be the concept of the expected increase in pay per trip due to the pay standard. So I want you to think about a trip before the policy went into effect. We know what the policy would have paid, so we know its actual pay, and we can calculate this counterfactual that would have what they would have been paid had the pay standard applied. And if the pay standard binds, we have this percentage increase in the fare. We can aggregate this over a particular route. And so our baseline definition of a route in the paper is going to be a trip occurring at a particular hour of the day of the week, between some pickup and ending location. And so these are going to be roughly the 5 boroughs. We're going to divide up Manhattan and Brooklyn into core and outer areas, the airports, and we have some out-of-town zones as well. So there's going to be around 20,000 of these routes. As a concrete example, a route is going to be a trip between Brooklyn and Manhattan at 5 a.m., between 5 and 6 a.m. on a Tuesday. That's going to be one example. So here you can see the variation in the expected increase by route, by different definitions of a route here. So on the left-hand panel, I show the variation by hour of day and day of week. And you can see that the expected increase varies from about 4% increase on a Monday to close to a 14% increase on a Thursday afternoon. The right-hand panel is going to take noon, and it's going to look at variation across geographies. So even at a particular time of the day, there's quite a bit of variation depending on, here I'm showing the pickup location. On average, there's a 14% increase, but it ranges between 6% and up to 22%. So we're going to take this expected variation and we're going to put it in an event study specification. I'm running out of time, so I don't have time to go over this in particular. I want to move on to results. And so here is the first result. It's pay per trip. So you can think of this as the first stage. We've constructed this expected increase in pay per trip, and here's what actually happened. And so the results, all of the results I'm going to show you, they're elasticities. And so what we find here is for a 1% increase in expected pay per trip, we actually find that pay increased by 1.5%. So it's roughly 50% bigger than we expected. And we think this might be because very low paid trips disappear, but we're still investigating that. Here is fare per trip. And we find that fare per trip increases by essentially the same amount as pay per trip, implying around 100% pass through of this increase in pay into fares. And here is the result for the number of trips. So this is an outcome we actually can observe over the whole time period. And it's nice because it allows us for a pre-test, a test of a pre-trend in this period from July through February, which we don't see any evidence of. So we get an estimate here of -1, and I'll discuss how to interpret this on the next slide. So to recap, we're finding this actual increase in pay per trip a little bit bigger than what was expected. And on average, we're seeing this 100% pass through into fares. And so we can use these estimates to come up with how much we think prices and fares increase as a result of this pay standard. So the average increase in pay was expected pay was about 10%, which implies that prices and fares increased by about 15%. We can get an estimate of the demand elasticity, which is -0.68, implying trips fell by 6.8%. We can use our estimates to come up with an estimate of the increase in hourly pay, which is going to be the sum of the percent change in pay per trip and trips per hour. So for this 15% increase in pay and fares, we find that hourly pay, it implies that hourly pay increased by about 4.5%. And a key finding, too, that came out from looking at those dynamic estimates from the event study is that our results are persistent, at least over this 11-month period that we studied. So with that, in terms of, we have some future directions that we're going. I showed you estimates today that use variation at the route level. And so we're working to aggregate this exposure to be at the driver level based on pre-existing schedules that drivers had before the policy went into effect. This is going to allow us to estimate driver level outcomes that are first order and the things that we all care about, like weekly pay. It should also allow us to estimate important parameters like labor supply elasticities. And we're also evaluating other policies that went into effect, such as a new congestion charge that applied to specific areas of the city. And so that's my 10 minutes. Thanks, everybody. Okay. Did we have Alejandro join us in that time by any chance? Okay, if not, we can move on to you, Michael.
Okay. So I have to figure out how to do the share screen thing here, right? Here we go. Is that up there? But I can't figure out how to expand it. There we go. Okay, is that visible? So this is a, whoops. Thank you, excuse me, Dmitri, for hosting this. This is a pleasure to move into a new era of remote technology, the LYRIC conference. So Ken Jacobs and I have been working on the effects of AB5 in California. As probably everybody knows, this is kind of ground zero for where labor standards and worker protections are at the moment. And it's also been highly contested. We're looking in this talk, in this presentation, at 3 scenarios. One that is the pre-AB5 scenario, which was appropriate up to 2019. Well, not appropriate, but in place up to 2019. Then we look at how AB5, the switch to employee status for the drivers, hypothetically would change driver pay, driver hours, structure of the workforce, and so on. And it's hypothetical because the companies have been resisting implementing AB5, even though it's the law of the state. And then the third scenario involves a partial repeal of AB5 that would occur if a ballot measure that's on the November ballot in California is passed. That measure is backed by $110 million coming from 5 companies, a consortium of Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, Postmates, and I guess Instacart. Yeah. Okay. So the context, which I've already gotten into, is since 2015 already, the State Department of Labor Standards Enforcement found that individual drivers are employees, and that was using the prior standards, which I think were called the Novello criteria. The Dynamex decision in 2018 was a unanimous decision that simplified the prior situation and established these 3 standards, ABC, which I won't go into, but basically it makes it a lot easier to argue that the drivers are employees than before. And then AB5 was passed in the fall of 2019 and signed by the governor, and it codifies Dynamex, expands it to unemployment insurance, and puts it in the labor code. The companies have still said they are not subject to the law, claiming that they don't fall under it. And in May, just a month ago, the Attorney General of the state and 4 district attorneys filed a lawsuit requiring them to comply with the law. And this is for something called injunctive relief, which means it's on behalf of all drivers. It's not an individual lawsuit, and nor is it a class action, which the drivers have opted out of by signing on to the companies are required to sign on to. So the ballot initiative by the companies, as I said, defines the drivers as independent contractors, and it promises, it looks good on paper because it promises 120% of the applicable minimum wage, whether it's the state or the local minimum wage, for engaged time only, however, which means the time that drivers are getting a passenger or have a passenger in their car, and that's only a portion of the time that they actually have their apps on, and that they're promising 30 cents a mile reimbursement, whereas the IRS standard is 57 cents a mile, and they have some healthcare supplements for some of the drivers. I'll move on in the interest of keeping this going more quickly. So what would happen, there's now been a study commissioned by these 5 companies that's been publicized by the consortium of 5. It's heavily advertised on TV, the results, and they come from a consulting firm called BRG, which I'm embarrassed to say stands for Berkeley Research Group, because it was started by David Teese, one of our colleagues up here, and includes Dave Lewin, also from LIRA, who I think was the chief researcher. And this report claims that there would be a massive reduction in labor supply, which is unusual when you have pay increases, huge reductions in demand because the prices would go up so much, and the 90% reduction, or 80 to 90% reduction in the number of drivers, which they count as about 1 million drivers in California. And unfortunately, we can't really study the report because the authors have refused to share it with us. They say that it's not theirs to share, but they have publicized it. The consortium has nonetheless not been shy about flooding the airwaves in the last couple of weeks with an ad that features this result. Uber more recently gave a summary of its own study, internal study, to a reporter at CNET. Again, the full report's not public, and they come up with slightly smaller numbers, but they're still pretty large. And they say they would eliminate 158,000 work opportunities. Maybe they call them jobs, but a lot of them are people who drive 4 or 5 hours a week. So it might be more like a mini job in the German sense. And again, we don't have the data to assess how they did this, much less, how credible it is. So we have gone ahead. We have costed out the ballot initiative and discovered that it's not really binding. And also we've costed out what employee status would amount to for driver pay. And where the first row here is hourly pay because of the minimum wage, benefits, full benefits, and as employees and expense reimbursement at 57 cents a mile, that adds up to $30.93. That's quite a bit more than the drivers we think are getting now. What are they getting now? Well, the data on this, the data sources are very sketchy. There's the only study that we have found for California is the Holland-Kruger study, which is based on a survey, and they, using a weighted average of their results for San Francisco and Los Angeles, weighted more heavily toward Los Angeles as being more representative of all of California, we estimate that the drivers were being paid $18.85, very different from the $30.93. They also have a chart showing that pay did not increase over the prior several years. So we think that $18.85 would be one estimate that would go all the way to 2019, given the lack of pay increase, a conservative estimate. But if you just take any simple adjustment for, conservative adjustment for spillovers, because there have been lots of minimum wage increases subsequently, and also that multi-app drivers are higher, overall have higher income. The Uber study was based only on Uber only time. I would say, well, maybe 2112 would be a better estimate. So we use both of these, a range from 1885 to 2112 to get low and high increases. So it's 64% or 46%, depending on whether you use 1885 or 2112. That's the pay labor cost increase. Then we talk about labor cost increase offsets. The main one being if the drivers would be more efficient in the time that they work, they would carry passengers more of the time, which we predicted would happen in New York City. We use a smaller effect of 16% in how this would offset the labor costs. I don't have time to go through all the steps. Traffic congestion would maybe increase speed by 3%. That's over 22 miles, over a base of 22 miles an hour. So we're talking about a 0.66 increase in speed, not a big one. And turnover costs would go down as the drivers, there were few driver intakes and drivers stayed longer with the job, as we found in research on minimum wages. So when we put all this into one table with both low and high estimates of 46 and 64%, and we put in these savings, we get an adjusted change in operating costs, or which includes a constant commission rate of between 21 and 37%, quite a bit less than the 46 and 64%, but still substantial. However, the commission rate is about 25% in the industry, and that's really, those are really rents. This is a duopoly. The comparable platform industries like Visa, MasterCard, Venmo charge about 2.5 to 3%, and 1/10 of that in, thank you, I saw that, and 1/10 of that in Europe. So, and the companies would want to reduce their commissions a little bit so that they could get more volume of commissions. They would reduce their commission rates a little bit, at least 2.5%, and it might be as much as 10% if they were capped at 15% commissions, which has already happened to the delivery companies, the DNCs in 4 cities, including San Francisco, Chicago, Seattle, and what's the other one? I think Los Angeles. Anyway, when we do that, we get a price increase that the midpoints here are about 14% and 31%. And then in my last minute or whatever, I'll just say we used Uber estimates from Cohen Hall Company of a minus 0.36 with demand elasticity, which gives us a decline in demand. We find that the compensation would actually increase by about 41% to 60% or 58% based on these two estimates, aggregate compensation. And of course, COVID, which we don't talk about too much, is going to decrease elasticity substantially because the people who don't really need to ride in those cars are not riding, and the rest are less price sensitive. Interestingly, though I haven't calculated it, but it seems pretty clear, the commissions would actually increase under all four of our scenarios. So I think the companies are actually doing themselves in from what they could actually be better off with this regulation. To conclude, this 85 will improve overall driver welfare. The ballot initiative would not. The reduction driver numbers will concentrate among marginally attached drivers. That's actually an argument that Uber made to the CNET reporter because of the fixed costs of intaking those drivers. And by casually or marginally attached, I mean, say those who are driving much less than 10 hours a week. And quite a few of them are driving between 4 or 5 hours. And with fewer cars on the road and more efficient industry, we're going to have less congestion and more pollution. And I just close with this point that better data is needed. We're putting together some sketchy sources here. And the companies have this data that's supplied to the Public Utilities Commission in California, which is the regulatory agency. But they've been refusing to share it with anyone, unlike the situation in New York City. Thank you. I'm done.
Great. If we still don't have Alejandro, I think we should move on to the discussion.
Sure.
Great. Can you see my screen?
It says just Zoom. Now we can. Perfect.
Okay, terrific. Great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to attend and to discuss these three presentations papers. Let me start by saying that although Alejandro wasn't able to make it, these were really closely related papers. I'll just say a few words about his co-authored paper. His paper starts off by showing, I think quite convincingly, that rideshare workers earn less than advertised by companies and often less than the minimum wage. And then we have these two papers that you just saw, or presentations, that provide preliminary evidence on public policies designed to improve rideshare workers' pay. And show that they are, in the case of New York City, or would be in the case of California, at least moderately successful in achieving that goal. So what I'd like to do is to provide some very brief comments on each paper and then conclude with some general comments for discussion for the group, I hope. So in terms of Alejandro's paper analysis of individual economies of ride-hailing drivers, it's described as an ethnographic study. He's done some really careful data collection effort to put together a representative sample of rides given by Lyft and Uber drivers in the Denver metro area with some detailed pay. You know, he's doing it, data on driver pay, miles driven, wait times, and so forth. And as I mentioned, they make a compelling case that net hourly pay, that is taking into account driver costs, and the wait times, so they're not earning income while they're waiting for their next ride, although they arguably are working, is considerably lower than gross pay and then advertised by companies. In his case, he finds that his median pay is less than the minimum wage. His mean is $8.15 an hour, and it's just considerably lower than the mean hourly wage for payroll employee drivers of over $13, according to BLS data from the Occupational Employment Statistics Program. And again, these are OES data that are just for drivers, basically taxi type drivers, who are wage and salary workers. So the paper suggests, and I'm going to return to this theme, information problems. In particular, drivers have a difficult time estimating net pay. He really shows how difficult this may be to compute and how it varies across drivers. I'm not going to go through all my points here, but he suggests that the high driver turnover may be partly explained. High driver turnover that we see in these rideshare companies, Uber, Lyft, and the like, may be partly explained by drivers realizing over time that expenses are higher than net wages. Expenses are higher and net wages are lower, rather, than they initially expected going into it. That's a hypothesis, but it does suggest a fundamental problem with the rideshare business model, if true. I'm going to return to this point at the end of my comments. So next, let me turn to the Koustas, Parrott, and Reich paper on New York City. That one is, as Dmitri explained, examines the effects of the introduction of minimum pay rates in New York City in February of 2019. So it really addresses two fundamental questions. To what extent do setting minimum rates increase drivers' pay per trip or hourly wages and earnings? And conversely, to what extent are these eroded by decreased demand and longer wait times? Of course, drivers, although the pay increases, they are not paid while they're waiting for a new job. So if the demand decreases and there's some sort of supply or there's a supply response, they may actually earn less, potentially. So they do a basic pre-post event study research design using these data that cover all apps across the city. They define these detailed routes based on geography, starting and endpoints, hour of day, day per week, as Dmitri explained, with over 20,000 kind of route combinations. And the key variable is this predicted average increase in fare. The key variable in their regression models is this predicted average increase in fare for route based on the pre-period data. And some, if they're non-binding, that predicted increase would equal 0. Just as an aside, I'd like to say that I thought that the tests for pre-trends in the paper were a really nice empirical feature, and I found them quite convincing. So the results overall are generally quite sensible. We see with a rise in the rates, we see a decline in trips, and the elasticity of demand with respect to predicted fare hike is higher for poor districts and districts closer to mass transit, completely sensible. The somewhat anomalous result that Dmitri flagged was that the elasticity of pay per trip with respect to predicted increase is greater than 1, right? A lot greater than 1, it's 1.5. And they just kind of hypothesize that might be related to dropping of very low fares. It sounds like this is something they're going to dig into in revising the paper, and that certainly makes sense. I think they want to look at whether there's evidence that poor neighborhoods, for example, are no longer served. Are there unintended consequences of this pay increase or fare increase? So just a couple of suggestions. I really wanted to see what happens to the distribution of fares and wages following the imposition of these minimum rates. To what extent do we observe fare and wage compression versus kind of spillover effects onto other fares? If I'm understanding the specification correctly, I think there has to be some level of fare compression going on here, but it would be nice to see the distribution of this pre and post. Platform companies may want to maintain rate structures to continue to provide incentives to drivers to drive at certain times and in certain places. And this would all be analogous to spillover effects of minimum wage increases. And so it would be interesting to kind of get a sense of that. And then just briefly on the extensions to their empirical work that Dmitri mentioned to look at driver effects. I'm sure they're planning to do this anyway, but it would be very nice to see how the selected sample is, how selected the sample of drivers is, because they have to be in both periods. So there are people, we hear a lot from like the JP Morgan Chase Institute studies and others, how much drivers go in and out. The typical driver is in for no more than 3 months, for example. And that seems to be something that, gets repeated when people summarize this literature. How many people are actually staying in? The next paper had a nice discussion about how these long drivers who are relatively attached for a long period of time actually count for a large share of all the driving that's done. So they seem to be quite important, but it would be nice to get a sense of them. It would be nice to see how the same equations that are presented in this paper based on routes differ when we use a subsample of continuously employed drivers. And do the rates, there's kind of an implicit assumption that the sort of distribution of routes doesn't change before and after the rate change, but you could imagine that if the rate structure becomes quite compressed across routes, then it might influence where they drive, and there may or may not be some interesting angles you could take there. Changes in hourly rates could be decomposed into changes in the rates for routes and the routes driven. So just a couple of ideas. Let me turn to the final paper, Jacobson Reich, about the driver pay in California, and this really interesting kind of debate, sort of a fight, as it were, over whether the driver rideshare companies, platform companies, Uber, Lyft, and the like, are going to comply with AB5, or whether they're going to get this ballot initiative passed and bypass the whole thing. One point that I wanted to make at the very beginning was in kind of reading up on the gig ballot initiative. That struck me is that it really has elements of the old Seth Harris and Alan Kruger proposal of 2015 in the following, at least in the following sense, that it allows platform companies to facilitate benefits and workers' compensation without needing to classify workers as employees. That was kind of a key feature of their proposal that was made at the Brookings Institution at the end of 2015. So some of the key questions that are asked in this ongoing work are, what are the effects of workers? Obviously, there's a trade-off between wage increases and reduction in demand, owing to price rise and lower employment. And secondly, although less of the focus of this presentation, and I think this work, is what are the effects on consumers in terms of a price rise, and of course companies in terms of the profits and sustainability of their business model. So the key findings and arguments presented by Michael in the presentation are that prices rise, but by less than the wage increase because of cost savings. That's because of increased utilization, increased vehicle speed, less driver turnover, and reduced commissions. And then going to that point, commissions, they argue, will and or should fall because they're currently 25%, which they argue to be kind of a monopoly profits. And they argue that the relevant comparison is credit card companies with commissions of only 2 to 3%. I would push back on that a little bit because I think these rideshare companies are quite different from credit card companies for sure in terms of their cost structure. I think a better comparison here would be temporary help agencies. They are quite different from rideshare companies in the following sense: they're competitive industry, but the sort of what they do is very similar to that, what the rideshare companies do in terms of matching workers to clients, and their commissions are much higher than 2 to 3%. Then the final outcome is that workforce falls. They argue that this is going to be concentrated amongst the marginally attached workers. I think that really needs to be spelled out. That would, in greater depth when you write this paper, because that'll be a concern, right? That'll be the pushback. Who are the marginally taxed workers? What do we, and what are the concerns around that? And then finally, is there a problem with making rideshare workers employees? Companies and some academics have argued that it's difficult to make workers employees because they don't control when the drivers work. They don't control the hours. Is there a way around that? This was really at the crux of the Harris and Kruger proposal that I've already mentioned back in 2015. I don't necessarily want to endorse that view, but I think it's something that you should certainly respond to in this paper or related writings. So let me turn finally to just a couple of quick general comments and issues that I'd like to bring up. I think that this paper, when you write it, and really all of the pieces here, would benefit by just kind of laying out what exactly is it the problem that we need to fix. Clearly it's low wages, but what's the source of that? Alejandro in his paper, co-author paper, really points to information problems. Companies have, information they don't share about demand, wait times, and destinations and the like. And workers in particular have really a lot of difficulty accurately estimating costs, in part because they lack information on time between rides, and it's just hard to estimate their costs just generally. And the solutions there might be regulations to require information provision, or like in New York City, minimum rights. Is it a monopsony or monopoly problem? The small number of rideshare companies dominate clearly the space, and workers lack bargaining power. Here we might think it's regulating pay or allowing workers to organize, but that could be done by making them employees, or through this third category of workers that Harris and Kruger propose. And then finally, it could be a lack of access is the real problem, lack of access to social safety nets afforded to employees. Here it could be, once again, reclassifying workers. The solution could be reclassifying workers as employees, or setting up this third category of worker. Anyway, I'm not advocating any particular solution or whatever, but I think some clarity about what is the problem here and what type of solution should we be looking to address it, it would be beneficial. The final thing that I wanted to touch on is that platform, another sort of part of the argument that the platform companies make is that it's just infeasible for them to employ drivers. The two distinguishing, in my view, characteristics of the rideshare business model have been one, that it uses, of course, the mobile app to order drivers. You don't have to stand out in the middle of Fifth Avenue and jump up and down and wave for people. That's clearly an efficiency gain. And the second distinguishing feature about this has been, although it doesn't necessarily have to be, is very low prices, much lower than taxi fares. And the real question, I think, is does this model offer efficiencies such that low fares are sustainable? Or does the business model inevitably lead to very low wages and high worker turnover? And is that just what we're seeing? We're sort of discovering it was kind of invisible at first because the gross pay was so much higher than the net pay once you factored in expenses. I think as Ken and Michael might argue, does it inevitably lead to very low wages with the current commissions, which they would argue are monopoly profits? I find my very final comment is that I think, and this may be outside of this almost certainly is outside the current scope of these papers, but I think it would be very interesting to have a comparison to put these into perspective to similar industries where workers are employees. I've mentioned the temporary help industry. That's one that I've studied quite a bit. They hire workers on flexible arrangements. Workers are in and out all the time, very high turnover. And they accommodate this with an employee-based model. I think the key difference is that they're doing it with, they're doing it for business clients as opposed to, for final consumers. But it's not obvious to me that it's not a sustainable model as employees, and that whole temporary help industry model doesn't undermine that argument. And then, of course, there's the taxi industry where many drivers work as independent contractors too. And do independent contractors in the traditional taxi industry face the same problems? that you're flagging for the on-demand platform companies. And if it's different, why is it different? But let me stop there. And thanks again for several very interesting presentations and papers.
Thank you, Sue. Thanks. Very excellent, thoughtful feedback for all of us. So why don't I'll take a chance to respond to some of that, then Michael and Ken and James also can jump in. So in terms of the distributions and whether we see compression versus kind of spillovers, what we see is a little bit of both. There is kind of this mass at exactly what you'd expect the pay standard to be, implying that they're being constrained. We also see more of the mass move to the right of the distribution. So it's not just compressing the distribution, it's kind of shifting the distribution to the right and to the high end. That's what we see in the histograms, but we should put those pay histograms in the paper. Regarding our finding this elasticity of 1.5 instead of 1, and I saw somebody had written in the chat that it makes no sense. So sorry, didn't find the answer that Mr. Ulrich didn't find it convincing that some of these rides are disappearing. I think we have to do more there to really nail that down. In terms of, you had mentioned incentives by the companies, so that there's also some original incentives built into this proposal, and Michael and James can talk more about that. And the companies, I didn't have time to say, have also responded with some restrictions on when and where people can work. And so that has been a consequence of the pay standard. Questions regarding turnover. So in New York City in particular, turnover is lower, I think, than elsewhere. Part of it is you have to be registered. There's expensive licensing fees. I think they're around $800 per year. So this is more than other places in the country, a full-time, more attached workforce. I think the attrition rates are roughly 30% per year. And so attrition is another outcome that we're looking at as a response as we move to the driver level estimates. Regarding the driver level estimates, we're still working on those, and we had some of the ideas that you had mentioned, but you gave us a lot more excellent ideas to work with. So thank you very much. I'll leave it there. I will raise a question though for Michael and Ken's paper when you get to that, and mainly because you mentioned welfare on the last slide. So pay is one thing and welfare is a slightly different concept. Now there's two papers that are being published or accepted, and I also have a paper in this space trying to measure the value of flexibility. So the other two papers are the Chevalier et al. Paper and the Angrist-Caldwell paper. And so they are estimating how much people who are marginally attached actually value this type of job. And another way to look at that turnover, it's a bad thing for a job at McDonald's, I think, when they see these high turnover rates, because it usually implies they don't like the job. But in terms of these rideshare jobs, it's possible that turnover is a feature, that people are working when they have particular gaps. Maybe they're working in the summer or they're working the holidays, and there aren't these other types of jobs where people can just work for a few weeks or months out of the year. And so some of those estimates that people value this flexibility is a few $1,000s. And if most of the workers are getting this extra benefit from it, that's not part of that cost benefit analysis. So I just was wondering how you were thinking about that as well. So great, thanks. And Michael and James, feel free to respond to any of other Sue's questions about our paper too. Please jump in.
First, because you just mentioned it, Dmitri, on the value of flexible work. I think that amounts to, from when I've looked at this in the past, this is a really important point, about 10% of pay is the premium that people seem to be finding for value of flexibility. And of course, it's not just over a month or a week, it's also during a day, being able to pick up your kids when they are in school or not, be able to go to classes and so forth. And I would say, and this is in response to Sue also, excellent comments, by the way, and I hope we can get a copy of your slides because will give us some good points to follow up on. But I would say that the Harris and Kruger proposal really didn't go anywhere. It was just, I don't think it will either. But you're absolutely right that the company proposal includes a minimum wage, as they included, I think, can't remember, benefits and worker comp, but it's nowhere near the kinds of protections and compensation that drivers would get as employees. And I think the companies have been setting this up as not a three-way, race, but a two-way race. That is, if you don't have the current situation, you're going to have employees working only 40 hours a week, 8 hours a day in regular, shifts. And I can't find, and no one else I've talked to has found, any requirement that employees have to work fixed shifts. In fact, there are quite a few who are able to work flexible shifts, including non-managerial employees. And in the literature research I've done using a couple articles in the Monthly Labor Review and elsewhere. So to give a specific example, Deliveroo, which is a delivery company that's employed or contracts with big retailers like Macy's and Gimbels and others, it has exactly that kind of flexible shift method. That is, they let the drivers essentially bid on shifts, maybe 4 hours each, that best meet their own conditions. So the alternative that the companies are posing here, that it's either complete flexibility or complete rigidity, is not the case. And also, it's the current case that the drivers can only work when there's demand. So 3 in the morning, you're not going to find many drivers working, even if it's convenient for them. So it is a situation that's a little bit different from the studies that Dmitri was referring to, where, because in this case, the pay is, the working hours a little more intermittent than, say, for call centers, and that paper that Alex Moss was a co-author of. So, but nonetheless, yeah, there could well be trade-offs. It could be that there is a need to allow drivers some flexibility. I think it can be done. UPS is another example, of course, where their employees, many of them work part-time, and those shifts now are mainly dictated by the company, but they don't need to be. Yeah, as to why wages are low, I think information does explain it on the labor supply side, as Alejandro's paper suggests, and any conversations I've ever had with a Lyft driver, confirms it. They don't have any idea other than their fuel costs. They don't understand about the really appreciated depreciation costs. Fundamentally, I think it is a monopsony problem, or duopoly problem, really, that the companies compete over market share. They want as many drivers on the road as possible. And that also allows them to minimize wait times for passengers. And so they're just flooding the streets with too many drivers. Now, that was the result of the Hall, Horton and Knepfli paper that Dmitri cited. In the New York City model that we recommended to New York, we said, well, let the companies have an incentive to reduce the number of drivers on the road, to limit labor supply and better manage their workers. And the companies could pay the drivers less per trip in our model if they increase the number of rides per trip. And so that's the kind of alternative mechanism that gets over the labor supply and duopoly issue. I'll stop there.
Great, thanks. So Ken had his hand up.
Yeah, I'd like to take Susan's question. I really appreciated your response to the paper. I think it's very helpful. I'd like to take the question, flip it around a bit, and say, what is the problem we're trying to solve in not having workers be employees? I was engaged in the discussions in California, and when you start and you say, here are all the rights of employment status, And in proposing that they don't have employment status, then the question is, which of these rights do you want to take away? And during that time, we heard things like unemployment insurance isn't relevant because people can come in and out. And then we learned very recently that unemployment insurance turned out to be extremely relevant. And so as we go through each of these, paid sick leave, obviously vitally important, as we've learned from the COVID-19 crisis. That is something that the ballot initiative would not only take away from drivers, but disallow cities and the state to create paid sick leave laws. Paid family leave is also something that can be, again, used during the COVID crisis as a place to take care of kids. Anti-discrimination rules. So as we go through each of those rights that are associated with driving status, I think that the argument has to be on the other side, why is there a compelling reason to say these rights should be taken away from this particular group of workers? And then one needs to have an argument that in doing so won't open the floodgates to other employers trying to push and take away those same rights. And so I think that it is a very, that to me is the turn that's important to make in this. And as Michael mentioned, I think there are lots of good examples on how you can have flexible work schedules as employees. So I think that the flexibility can be achieved. The issue is, I believe, has always been cost associated with providing those benefits and acknowledging those rights. And so that then becomes the question of, is there a model that you can do under the cost structure? Does this require really sub-minimum wages in order to work, or can it be done in a way that works?
Great, thank you. I can go read through some of the chat comments, unless there are other comments or responses people want to come in on. Okay, so Anil Verma says, some legal scholars say that setting up more categories of workers would lead to more litigation regarding the status of a worker. From Helen Liu to Susan and the panelists, if legislative changes require companies, e.g. Uber, to hire drivers as employees instead of treating them as independent contractors, can companies step back and then partner with the temporary help company to hire drivers as employees of the temporary THA?
Temporary help agencies.
Temporary help agency. Should we take that question? I think that's a good question.
Well, these are pretty large companies. You know, if their drivers were employees, they'd be among the largest companies in the United States. Because there are certainly over 1 million of these. And I think they can internalize what the temporary help agencies do. I don't think they have to, they could go outside, they could outsource. The underlying reality here is that they have, one area I agree with Sue's suggestions is that this is transportation, urban transportation. So there are some features specific to transportation, namely that you have big peaks and big valleys, as Dmitri's slide showed. And you have to somehow manage the labor supply to be able to meet those peaks and valleys. And so I think there would still be some part-time workers who would be hired. They wouldn't have to be 40 hours. If they were, the companies would be engaged in malpractice, frankly. You know, it's kind of like, why pay a lot of people just to meet the peak demand? You don't have to, when you don't have anything like that demand during the rest of the time. But I recognize that this has been a very contested issue in labor history. And if you look at the history of, say, subway drivers in New York City, I mean, the idea of a split shift where you work, during the rush hour in the morning and the rush hour in the evening, you don't get to work, you don't get paid for the time in between, was a major source of conflict between the operators and the city. And I think in some places now there's a premium for split shift work as one solution. So I think there are a number of models there.
Great. So I think that puts us at time. We'll leave with the history lesson. I think we can all learn more from history at any rate. Thanks, everybody. Thanks to the panelists. Thanks to the organizers. This was a really great discussion, and appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dmitri.
The general membership meeting is getting ready to start in the plenary stream, if you want to join us.